guys, and welcome to episode 190 of the OCDStories.com podcast. Now, this is a story-based episode where James Hervey kindly shares his story with us. And as always, thank you for listening to the podcast. And if it helps you in any way, I'd appreciate if you have a moment to leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to it, as it helps me reach more people. But without further ado, here is James. On the podcast today, I have James Hervey, who has kindly agreed to share his OCD story with us. Welcome to the show, James.
Hey, thank you, Stuart. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. And obviously, we met at the OCD conference in Texas.
Yeah.
So it's good to meet you.
For sure.
Cool. So, as you know, I always like to get people's OCD story. So, in as little or as much detail as you want to go into, it'd be good to hear that.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. My OCD story goes back quite a ways, even though I didn't really know until earlier this year that that's what it was. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last 5 or 6 months as I've been working with my therapist. And the first or earliest memory of OCD-like symptoms that I can remember was when I was about in the 5th grade, so maybe 10, 11 years old, and I had read the Stephen King story, The Boogeyman, out of the collection Night Shift. And, in that story, the Boogeyman is following a person around and hiding in the closet and attacking his family. And I got obsessed with the idea that the Boogeyman was in my closet and was unable to fall asleep without the light on and the closet door open. And I remember getting up multiple times to check the closet during the evening. I know that now to be OCD-like symptoms, that, I was having anxiety from an intrusive thought and engaging in rituals to try to deal with the anxiety. But, as a 10-year-old, no idea what was going on. And, I was able to kind of get through that at some point. I also have some other memories of obsessions and compulsions from when I was younger. I remember that I used to have a ritual where at night when I would go to bed, I lived in a 2-story house, and our family room where the TV was on one far end of the house on the 1st floor, and my bedroom was on the other far end of the house on the 2nd floor. And when I would go to bed, I would get incredibly anxious that someone was waiting in the house to attack me. So I would sort of have this belief that as long as the lights were on, I would be safe. So I would sort of leapfrog through the house, walking forward one room, turning the light on, walking back one room, turning the light off, so that the light and the light was always on in front of me. I used to be very concerned that I was going to get attacked when I took the trash out. We lived at the end of a very long driveway. So I would take the trash down to the bottom of the driveway, and then I would sprint as fast as possible back to the top of the driveway. And those sort of anxiety about my safety continued with me for a very long time into my 20s and 30s. I started to get very anxious about my career. I would become obsessed with the idea that I was about to get fired. I would engage in a lot of reassurance-seeking rituals, sort of subtly trying to get my boss to hint at, whether they thought my job performance was good or not, asking around other people inside of my company about certain situations that I had become convinced were going to lead to me losing my job. And all of that was really rough. I mean, the anxiety around it was all pretty rough, but, none of it really seemed incredibly out of the ordinary to me. And, this is something I'll talk about in a little bit about, not understanding exactly how OCD functions. But, I was able to manage through a lot of that. I did start drinking alcohol heavily when I was in college. And I do think that, a lot of my use of alcohol was really predicated on dealing with my anxiety, both anxiety brought on by OCD, but also just generalized anxiety. Like, I think like a lot of people with OCD, I'm just an incredibly anxious person in general. So, I struggle with anxiety that is not OCD related either. That is, just an overreaction to, what are sort of standard fears that anybody would have, not the weird obsessional fears that I get with OCD. I did stop drinking about 16 years ago. So, I've been sober for 16 years.
Nice.
It's been great. And that's been wonderful. And I think, the foundation of some of the recovery work that I've done there was really helpful in my OCD recovery this year. Just being a little more open about sharing with people about what's going on with me, and, having a framework for recovery, I think was really beneficial. Yeah. But, I sort of was able to manage through a lot of that anxiety and a lot of those sort of OCD symptoms, over the last couple of decades without it, having a significant impact on my life. And then, about 2 years ago, OCD popped up in some very distressing places. I started to struggle with sexual and violent obsessions. They just sort of came on out of the blue one day. I had watched a documentary about a kidnapping, and for whatever reason, I just could not get this documentary out of my head. And anytime I had to stop watching it because the anxiety it was causing was so great. Anytime I would pass it on my Netflix queue, I would get incredibly anxious. I remember, I would be in yoga class and all of a sudden this documentary would just start playing through my head. And and then I started thinking to myself, well, why are you so obsessed with this? Is it because secretly, you want to kidnap people? Is it because, secretly you're a sociopath or a really bad person? And, these spikes of this kind of thinking would come on for weeks at a time, and then they would sort of settle down and I would just, kind of go on with my life. But, then it would come back, and, I can remember, another time about a year and a half ago where I was sitting in church, and I just could not stop thinking about whether I was going to engage in violent acts in church. And that was really distressing, obviously. I just could not get that out of my head. And then I started to have intrusive thoughts about my dogs, which was incredibly distressing. I just could not. There were times when they would get so bad that I would have a hard time even, petting or engaging with my dogs at all, because I was just so anxious that there was something, buried or some seed inside of me that was just this evil sociopathic person that was going to harm or torture or whatever crazy imagery OCD was deciding to throw into my brain. It all culminated for me in the end of February. We have a holiday here in the U.S., President's Day, so I had a 3-day weekend. I live with one of my best friends and his girlfriend, and they were out of town. So I was home by myself for 3 days. And the OCD spiking actually started about a week before that. I can't remember exactly when it started, but I do remember that whole week I spent obsessively Googling, can you become a sociopath in your 40s? Can you go psychotic in your 40s? Because, rationally, I knew that, people who are psychotic or sociopathic display those tendencies really, really early, right? And they don't question the nature of their thoughts. They just believe them. But I wanted assurance. I wanted certainty that I wasn't going crazy, because it felt like I was. And of course, like anyone with OCD, I would get some assurance from reading a website or from running through the checklist of signs in my head and going, nope, 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 nope. But eventually the intrusive thoughts would return, and the anxiety would return, and I'd be right back where I started. I got to a point where I couldn't go to church. I was avoiding certain people and situations. And by Friday of that week, I was having obsessional intrusive thoughts constantly. I mean, there was really no break throughout the entire day. And I remember during that weekend, I remember trying to watch like a very basic documentary about the documentary about Alex Honnold, free climbing El Capitan. And I couldn't even watch it because I was just getting all these intrusive thoughts about harming the people in the documentary. I had to shut it off.
Yeah.
I was barely able to walk my dogs. I would have to look away while I clipped the leash, and it was just brutal. I would go on these walks around the neighborhood because what I was doing during that weekend is I had picked up an Eckhart Tolle book, and I was reading the Eckhart Tolle book compulsively because it was providing me with relief. I would read some stuff in the Eckhart Tolle book, and it would provide me with relief. And then I would think, okay, I fixed it, right? I did this little meditation exercise in the book. I fixed whatever's going on in my brain. I'm going to go for a walk around the neighborhood and prove to myself that I'm not going to have these thoughts. And so then I would go for the walk around the neighborhood, and I would see like a building, and I would just immediately get a thought about blowing up the building. And you can imagine the distress involved in that was just unreal. By Monday of that week, I was in such bad shape. I'd had 3 or 4 panic attacks because I would come back from these walks and I would just be so scared about what was happening in my own brain that I just shut down. I couldn't function. I would be rocking back and forth on the couch, my mouth just open and like a silent scream, sobbing, just unable to function for, 20 minutes. And then I would go back to reading the Eckhart Tolle. But by Monday, I was convinced that I was either going to hurt myself or drive to the liquor store because I just couldn't take what was happening in my brain. And, fortunately, like I said, I've, been in recovery for 16 years for some other things. And so I have a very strong network of people that don't get fazed very easily by stuff. And so I called a few of them, and they came and sat with me and talked a little bit, and ended up taking me to a psychiatric hospital here in Atlanta. And that was the first time, by the way, that I ever heard the term intrusive thoughts. I'd never heard of it before, but in the intake interview, as I was selectively describing to the intake person what was going on with me, very scared to, say as much as, to say 100% of what was happening in my brain, because I was convinced the straitjacket and the padded room were coming for me for the rest of my life. And honestly, at that point, I would have welcomed it, right? If that's what it was needed to keep me safe and keep society safe from me, then fine, let's do it. But they admitted me. I had some time in the waiting room before I got taken back to the unit, and so I started Googling because people with Puro love to Google. It's a great thing for us. I say that sarcastically. It's not at all. But in that instance, it actually was good because I Googled intrusive thoughts, and I came across the website intrusivethoughts.org. And in that waiting room, reading through that website, and in particular, Allegra Carstens wrote a post on that website that just described in brutal detail what was happening in my head. And it was the first time that I'd ever really connected the way that, things happen for me with obsessive compulsive disorder. Because my opinion of OCD had always been, monk and as good as it gets, and the movie Matchstick Men, it's got to be cleanliness and orderliness and counting and checking. And if we were on video right now, you would see that cleanliness and orderliness are not content that that my OCD brings up in any way, shape, or form. Although I'll say that in the middle of my last spike, I did get a preview of what that could look like, because during that spike, I came to the conclusion that if I could rid my house of anything impure, that that would rid myself of the impure thoughts. So I took a bunch of books, a bunch of Thomas Pynchon novels and John Irving novels and Graham Greene novels that I had considered impure, and dropped them off in little free libraries all around town. And then I also like cleaned my kitchen deeper than I've ever cleaned it before. So I'd imagine that left to my own devices and untreated, I could probably go there if I got enough relief from it. But sitting in that waiting room in the hospital, you know, that's all I had ever thought of OCD, and I'm not a clean person. That was the first time I'd ever been exposed to the concept of puro, or primarily obsessional OCD. You know, I was in the hospital for a week, and I will say that, you know, the hospital, the psychiatrist there mentioned OCD, but never really provided a formal diagnosis, but did put me on an SSRI while I was in the hospital. And within a week, the SSRI had started to work and give me some relief. I wasn't getting a ton. I've gone back and read my journals from, you know, the first few days out of the hospital. And, you know, I was struggling to go to Target. I was struggling to, you know, walk my dogs. But at least I felt like there was an answer here. After I got out of the hospital, I was in an IOP for a month, and the IOP was great, although it obviously wasn't focused on OCD. But just being in a clinical environment for a month was really beneficial. But I was able to find a therapist here in Atlanta who had listed OCD as a specialty. We had a phone screen, and by the end of the phone screen, you know, I had an incredible amount of hope. You know, I called him, and you know, he asked me to describe what was going on, and I started telling him some of the thoughts I was having. And then he asked me point blank about one of the more sort of shameful, dark subtypes of OCD that I've had. And him asking me directly about that was the first time I'd ever been able to kind of admit that content. And that was an incredible breakthrough for me. And it was how I knew right away that therapist and I were going to gel. So I went and had an appointment with him, and he laid out the exposure and response prevention therapy that we were going to do. You know, he was very clear with me that it was going to be very difficult, that, you know, I was going to have to intentionally expose myself to anxiety, that, you know, that he wasn't going to cure me, that I was going to, you know, help myself by having the courage to do the therapy that we laid out. And we really laid out a therapy plan in a partnership, which was great. You know, I gelled with him almost immediately. And, you know, we started doing exposure therapy that first visit in his office. You know, he asked me about the content of my OCD. He brought out some magazines to look at. You know, he had me rate my SUDS levels, all the good stuff we do during exposure and response therapy. You know, we went through a white box assessment. He had me do one on how I felt prior to going into the hospital, and then he had me do one as I was sitting in his office. And then we just started doing it. You know, he started giving me homework to do. There were assignments, places I had to go, movies I had to watch. You know, like I have this weird obsession about turning into a serial killer. So there were a lot of, you know, watching the Ted Bundy tapes and other documentaries like that. There's a great documentary on Netflix right now about Madeleine McCann. So I sat through that, all 7 or 8 episodes of it. And, you know, that first month or so of ERP was just absolutely brutal. You know, I mean, I would leave the therapist's office just absolutely drained, you know, just, he had me do the classic ERP move where, you know, I walked into his office and there was a very sharp letter opener on the table. And, he had me pick it up and hold it, and then he started inching closer to me, and then ultimately, I had the letter opener up against his neck. And I mean, that was mentally one of the most draining things I have ever done. But it did teach me, some very important lessons. One, that, I could sit with anxiety, which I don't think I'd ever really realized before. I think I'd always thought that I had to try to do what I had to do to eliminate anxiety. And this idea that I could put myself in a situation that was, incredibly anxiety inducing and just sit with it, was really powerful. We also read Brain Lock together, the Jeffrey Schwartz book. And he had me start sort of applying the Brain Lock methodology in everyday life. Name it and redirect, basically, is what it all boils down to, right? Be aware of the intrusive thought, be aware of the obsession, and then try to redirect your energy, not to a compulsion, but to something positive. So, I kept a puzzle in my house. I had Legos in my house. I had my guitar available. And so anytime I would feel myself starting to go into the OCD hole, I would just try to redirect onto one of those. And, now after I'd say 5 or 6 months of therapy, I'm in pretty good shape. I mean, I still get intrusive thoughts. I can still get into an obsessional thinking loop, but I'm able to spot it pretty quickly and know what it is and sit and wait for it to pass. I think, a couple months ago, I went to a wedding and in Houston, and I was doing some ERP in the hotel room before I went to the wedding, some writing that my therapist asked me to do. And then I went to the wedding, and there were these police officers there for security, and I could not get out of my head the idea that they were there to arrest me because someone in the hotel 20 miles away had heard me reading out my writing and called the police. And, I felt this real urge to keep walking past the cops to, see if they would arrest me and, ask a bunch of people why they were there. But I was able to, and I did that once or twice, and then I was able to, really spot what was going on and just sort of say to myself, I value my friendship with this person who I'm here for, and I value the conversations I'm having with my friends at this table, and I'm going to continue to do that in the face of the anxiety and the urge to seek relief. And so that was a huge breakthrough. That was the first time where I really believed that just sort of out in life, not in a therapeutic setting or, intentionally sitting down to do exposure and response prevention, that I could actually sort of function, not just without the intrusive thoughts or the anxiety there, but in the face of them. And so, that was pretty powerful. So as I sit here today, I'm in, really good shape. I had a little OCD episode earlier this week and went on for, 20 or 30 minutes. And then I just went, hey, this is ridiculous. This is definitely OCD. And I went and read a book, and eventually the thoughts passed, So yeah, feeling really positive. The conference was amazing. It was great to be in a room with a lot of people who sort of understood what I was going through. I'd never, had not had a chance to experience that yet. I found the evening support groups to be incredibly powerful. So that's my OCD story, and a little long-winded, but I hope somebody can identify with it.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And there's loads of detail there. I think it was great, and especially the detail you went into your kind of recovery process. You mentioned about kind of learning that you can have anxiety and live with it anyway. And to me, that's a wonderfully big ephany. Was there any other kind of light bulb moments for you that something just clicked?
Yeah, I think a couple. So I think, I have for all my life, dealt with, the fallacy of thought action fusion, or the cognitive distortion of thought action fusion, right? And always believed that my thoughts carry incredible meaning, right? Like no matter what, my thoughts carry incredible meaning, and that they always have to say something about me and my character, right? And so I think, a huge epiphany for me was that a lot of thoughts are just meaningless. They're just pointless, right? I think, I went to the session at the conference where the psychologist played a video of him treating a patient and sort of walked through the process of what he was doing. And, he basically said, content is trash. Like, and he made this like arm waving motion of like, I'm throwing it all away. And that was, that whole part of this has been a real epiphany to me too, that a lot of thoughts are they're nonsensical. They're just electrons firing in the brain. They don't really have a lot of meaning. That was pretty incredible for me too. I think the other thing, I made a decision probably about 2 months into my recovery process to start being public about what I have. I've spoken with coworkers about it. I've spoken with friends and family about it. I've shared about it publicly and openly on social media. And I think I have been blown away and surprised by the incredible level of support that I've gotten. I think I was expecting a lot more raised eyebrows. Even as I, delved into some of the content of my OCD, I think once I walk through educating people how the disorder works, that, the stigma has not been as big as I thought it would be. My daughter is she's a border millennial Gen Z, so she's right on the border, but I will say her generation is just amazing when it comes to things like mental health, right? Her friends have been, and she and her friends have been some of the most supportive people in the world for me. And that's really encouraging to see. Yeah. So I think some of those were big eye openers for me. I'm also kind of shocked by, how much misinformation about mental illness exists out there, and how much layman's diagnosis and sort of layman's treatment paths happen in the world. You just need to exercise more, or maybe if you got some more sleep, or, eat better. It's like, yeah, all those things are great. They're helpful and they aid in a recovery process. But, I have poor wiring in my brain, and a 30-minute run isn't going to fix that.
Yeah.
That's been interesting for me to learn too.
Okay. No, thank you. That was great. And I agree. The younger generation, I think, because of the internet, they're far more open and accepting of things, which is great, isn't it? It's hopeful for anyone in the future who goes through anything like this.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So similar question is, was there a big sort of roadblock on your journey? And if so, how did you overcome it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say in the recovery phase, no. I mean, the recovery phase has been miraculously smooth. But I think the biggest roadblock that I could come up with is, not knowing enough to seek treatment. And that's one of the reasons why I ultimately decided to be public about my story, and to share it more widely is, I really do believe that if OCD was better understood in the general consciousness, that I would have sought help a lot sooner. In fact, I actually saw a therapist when I was younger, and I hid some of the thinking that I had from therapists because I didn't want to talk about it. I thought it made me crazy or bad or weird. And, had I known that content could have been, related to a mental disorder like OCD, I might have shared it, And so I think the biggest roadblock for me was just lack of awareness on my part of what OCD looks like. and knowing that OCD could manifest itself in things other than cleanliness and orderliness, and that there didn't have to be, very observable physical compulsions that accompany it. There didn't have to be hand washing or hoarding or excessive cleaning, but, it could manifest itself in the types of mental rituals that I was engaging in. So I would just say my own sort of lack of awareness and knowledge was probably the biggest roadblock to me seeking help and getting treatment. I had to wait till it was bad enough that I was thinking about self-harm before I was willing to open my mouth and say something, other than, doing sort of very high level, basic reassurance seeking behaviors, which, it's just OCD in and of itself. So again, that's a big part of why, I'm talking to you right now, why I've decided to share openly on Instagram and in public with my friends and family about my journey and my symptoms and my recovery. So
yeah, and I love it. Okay, cool. So if let's say you met someone at the conference and you saw them and they looked like they needed some hope, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, recovery is possible, right? I feel like I'm entering into a recovery phase of my life. So the first thing I would say is recovery is possible. If I saw them, stammering to sort of describe their OCD, I would look at them, dead in the eye, and I would say, no matter what you've thought, no matter how weird or bad you think it is, I've probably thought it. So don't feel any shame in sharing it with me. It's okay. You're not alone. And then I would basically tell them, look, I went from hospitalization to being able to function better than I was at my peak in less than 6 months. So have the courage, face the anxiety, do the work, and you can live a really full life, even in the face of this very torturous disorder.
Yeah, good words, and I like the do the work. So similar question then, and you somewhat answered it, but I guess it's this person's now asking you a follow-up question. Let's say they've just started therapy. What would you tell them? Was there something that you would have wished you had known in your first few sessions?
I think I would tell them it's going to be really hard, right? Like, I want you to know before you start that this is going to be difficult, right? That you are going to put yourself in situations where you're going to trigger your worst fears about the world and yourself. And then I would say, I know that sounds like a tall order, but I believe in you, and I believe that you're strong enough to do it. And if you do, the rewards that you're going to reap from it are going to be greater than you can imagine.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Love it. And is there anything else in terms of your journey of kind of opening up, and is there anything else you want to do for that? You obviously shared on social media and stuff, or is that kind of enough for you right now?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I've thought about doing some more long form writing about it, and potentially, sharing in blog form or something like that. I'm interested in, I'm interested in being a little more active with the IOCDF. So I'm looking into how that happens, and then I'm thinking about, what I can do from a peer support perspective, in working with people who are just coming out of treatment for this. We're a small community here in Georgia right now, and that's one thing I'd like to try to figure out. It looks like the IOCDF affiliate here has kind of died out. So I'm thinking about how that could get restarted. I've got a lot of ideas, just sort of working through what I have time and energy to actually do, because I am an overcommitter. So just trying to be mindful of what I'm able to do. But I feel pretty passionately about this, and I want to find, whatever way I can as a person with OCD and someone who's found some recovery from it to help others.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, cool. So,
by the way, I'm incredibly impressed by people like Rose Cartwright and Lily Bailey, who've just found these incredibly creative outlets to educate the broader public through entertainment and media. I just think it's spectacular, and I'm incredibly grateful for the work that people like that are doing. I think I sat through the panel, the one that we met at the end of at the OCD conference on OCD and the media, and it was just incredibly heartwarming to see people who are writing books and working on TV shows and giving interviews. It's just, it's incredibly powerful to see the difference in education that's happened in the last 15 or 20 years. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Okay, cool. So you could pick up the phone, call that 20-year-old self. What would you tell him?
Oh, so many things. I think I would tell him, find someone you trust and be honest with them about what's going on in your head, right? Like you don't have to hide. Find someone trustworthy and tell them what's going on in your head, because you can get help, and you don't have to wait another 20 years or 25 years before you actually find help for this. Like you can get help, but you can't get help if you're not telling someone what's happening.
Yeah, good point. And then you've got a billboard in Atlanta. What do you want written on that billboard?
Well, as it relates to OCD, I think I would probably write OCD is not an adjective. I think it's my favorite pithy saying about our disorder, and really kind of cuts to the heart of the misconceptions about it, and I will challenge people when I see that, when I see I'm so OCD or I'm a little OCD about my desk, I will challenge people. I try to do it in a very kind way, and I try to engage with my own personal story. So like I'll say, hey, I just want to, let you know that you can't be a little OCD, or you can't be OCD about your desk. And here's why, and then I'll say, listen, I have a good sense of humor. I can take a joke. I don't really care. But what you're doing when you do this is perpetuate misinformation that causes people to not get treatment, like me, and so I found that approach where, I acknowledge that there's no harmful intent, that I recognize that the person's just trying to be cute or clever. And then I share my personal story of why, that sort of misinformation was actually harmful to me. I found that approach to be successful 100% of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Good approach. Yeah, and most people aren't trying to be mean. They're just, they think they've got the truth and they're just saying something. And yeah, when you come with kindness and education, most people will listen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So is there firstly, thank you so much. And is there anything else that you wish you could have shared today?
Let me think about that for a second.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think the one thing I'd want to say, I imagine, your podcast is listened to not just by, those of us who are sort of in the community, but also by people who are trying to sort out themselves what's going on in their own head.
Yeah.
I maybe found you through Google search or something like that. And, I would just want to share that, really understand that if your thoughts are distressing you, they're not you. And, you, no matter how bad what you think is going on in your head is, there are those of us out there who've also thought it, and it doesn't define you. And you can get help to learn how to live in the face of the tricks that your own brain throws out there. And I also understand, right, that feeling of not being able to trust your own mind, not being able to trust your own brain is one of the scariest, darkest places that you can go. And even in that place, there's a lot of hope.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's kind of my parting shot, if you will. By the way, just saying parting shot, that was some exposure therapy right there for me. So.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much, James. It's been inspiring.
Yeah, thank you.
So there you have it. Thank you so much to James for sharing his story with us, and thank you to you guys for listening. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy, it is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.